Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm going to talk about Blood Death Knights and Dragonflight. Blood has undergone a lot of changes in the transition from the end of Shadowlands to the beginning of Dragonflight. Changes in cooldowns, changes in the amount of resources you have available, and changes in the way you prioritize your rotation. The result is a playstyle that is a lot more engaging than the simple spam Heartstrike to maintain Dancing Rune Weapon approach of late Shadowlands. It is slightly more complicated, but I think it's way less stressful. It makes full use of your kit, which isn't something you were necessarily doing in previous versions of the class, and I really appreciate that approach to class design. Use every part of the buffalo. It's also more consistent defensively, which is great news for any tank. This is about beta content at level 70. I mainly want to talk about the talents and how the class plays, particularly compared to how it's working right now in Shadowlands. If you'd like a pre-patch guide, I have that linked in the pinned comment. And as for a Dragonflight guide, that'll be coming once we're a little closer to the release. Let's start by going over the differences between level 60 and level 70 Blood Death Knights. You gain a lot of value as you add in another 5 points of talents to each tree. The capstones at the bottom of the class tree are mostly pretty good, but you had to choose between running Empower Rune Weapon or Abomination Limb, and now you can just get both of those super strong cooldowns at once. That is great. In the spec tree, it's basically the opposite situation. The capstones are mostly not very good, but you get more points to put into some of the really valuable passive talents that you just couldn't afford at level 60. You also gain more flexibility to pick up talents like Gorfiend's Grasp or Purgatory that have more situational value without having to make too huge of a sacrifice elsewhere. So now let's just jump in game and play around in the level 70 talent tree. Alright, I am in game, and here I have pulled 5 points out of each side of the talent tree in what I'm calling my Mythic Plus build, just to sort of simulate, a before and after of going from level 60 to level 70. And so this is more or less what I've been playing around with at level 60. You can see I have a couple of pretty high value talents that I've unfortunately only been able to put 1 point into in Shattering Bone over here on the right, which is a great DPS increase, especially in AoE. And well, the Necropolis over here on the left side, which is a fantastic defensive layer. But again, I've had to take other higher value single points elsewhere. So obviously I want to fill those in, and then on the left tree I want to come down here, go through Rune Mastery, which really isn't that great, but it's a free occasional strength proc, and get Abomination Limb, which is a very, very valuable offensive cooldown that you can use pretty much at the same time you use Empower Rune Weapon all the time. Unless you're about to end a pull, you pretty much want to use both of those on cooldown all the time. Unless you're holding them for some specific purpose. They add a lot of stat budget, a lot of damage value, and they're pretty nice to have. Then you sort of have like one leftover floating point over here in the left tree for Mythic Plus. Blinding Sleet is optional, Asphyxiate is optional. I kind of like having both of these. Asphyxiate is a pretty incredible single target stun. Blinding Sleet is not bad as an AoE CC, and having both of those along with Mind Freeze is, probably the best CC of overall value you can get. You could go into Anti-Magic Zone, you could come up here into Anti-Magic Barrier, depending on whether you want maybe a little more group value. You can take an Anti-Magic Zone and throw it onto some of your ranged party members if you're in a group spell damage heavy dungeon. Anti-Magic Barrier if you're having to deal with some, personal incoming damage. I really like March of Darkness just for kind of personal selfish mobility value. That's really nice. What I wouldn't recommend is Blood Draw. This is one of the worst talents around. 3-minute cooldown on a very, very, very weak AoE healing leech. And as you can see, it's not even built correctly. It doesn't even scale up when you put a second point into it. Unholy Bond is also pretty underwhelming for how deep it is in the tree. You get 2 points into this, and it makes your Fallen Crusader trigger for 18% instead of 15% more strength. It's just not very good. I wish Soul Reaper, just to touch on this down here at the bottom of the tree, since it is a capstone talent, I wish it worked better. It's 10 runic power. It does, unless your enemy's in execute range, it does less damage than Heartstrike, and it doesn't have any of the awesome talent synergies that Heartstrike has over in the right talent tree. So it really only functions as sort of a single target execute that's competing with your main rune spender. That's just not great. It really unnecessarily complicates the rotation. So this is kind of a stinker talent, bit of a bummer, because it is such a cool concept. If it didn't have the associated rune cost, or if they had made the admittedly bad decision to go back to the old style of Death Knight runes where you had all different flavors of runes and then you could use these and they weren't competing with Heartstrike runes, maybe that would have been something, but they didn't, which was the right call, so it's not. In Mythic Plus, I think you definitely need to take this right side of the tree. You have to come get Cleaving Strikes for AoE, of course. You can take Control Undead, depending on the dungeon you're doing. If there are any undead that you can mind control, this is extremely valuable. But if there aren't any, it's not valuable at all. So in general, I think Asphyxiate is the best call. If you want to be selfish with it, you could take Acclamation, that's good too. Cold Thirst is pretty nice if it's a caster-heavy dungeon. But we'll say Asphyxiate there, just for the sake of your average approach. Now over here in the right tree, you have Ironheart and Bloodshot, which add a lot of defensive value and a lot of offensive value, so you pretty much always want to take those two talents. Then you have a couple of choices here. You can take Gorfine's Grasp for some quick grip utility. I really like that. You can take 1 point in Red Thirst for a bit of modularity. I really like this about Red Thirst. Obviously it would be better if you just got the full effect for a single point, but the fact that you can choose to only put 1 point in is great. Maybe 90 seconds is too long on the Red Thirst cooldown, but maybe shaving it down to 45 seconds is a bit more than you need all the time. This is very, very true in more raid-oriented talent setups, where you're taunt swapping a boss back and forth. Maybe you do need Red Thirst to live through a mechanic every 50 to 60 seconds. So that 1 point is all you need, and the second is overkill, and you can put it somewhere else. What I wouldn't bother with, it's up to you. I mean, you can play around with it and see how you feel about it, but I'm fully out on Bone Storm. I have a lot of problems with this ability now. For one, it still costs 100 runic power, its damage has not gone up proportionally, and runic power is more valuable now. It only costs 35 runic power to Death Strike now, so it used to be 2.5 Death Strikes to cast a Bone Storm. Now it's 2.85, it's almost 3 Death Strikes to cast a Bone Storm. You get more healing out of your Death Strikes than you used to. You get this excellent talent synergy over here with Icy Talons, which causes your runic power spending abilities to increase your melee attack speed. For some reason, this doesn't count Bone Storm. So if you Bone Storm, you do not get Icy Talons refreshed. So you basically are guaranteeing that you're going to lose Icy Talons if you use Bone Storm. You have this other talent over here, Coagulopathy, which is a rolling blood plague damage taken debuff that you maintain by death striking a single target. Obviously, you're suspending your ability to keep that going if you take Bone Storm. So, because they didn't work out making Bone Storm interact with all of the things that interact with Death Strike, I think it's kind of dead. In general, I think taking that second point in Red Thirst and Mythic Plus just for the really, really nice defensive layers is the right move. You'll notice I haven't taken Improved Vampiric Blood up here, and that's because I think it's a little undertuned. I mean, just to show off 2 points, 10% more healing and absorb increase. It's already a baseline of 30%. And 4 more seconds, so 14 instead of 10. Totally an option, totally doable. The only thing that you're really giving up, if you take it, is Improved Heartstrike. Heartstrike is a large chunk of your damage, depending on what you're fighting. Single target, it's a bit lower, but in AoE, it really does add up to quite a lot of your damage. So I think that's just sort of something you have to kind of make on a case-by-case basis. Basically, how hard are you getting hit? How much danger are you in? If you're really getting just scorched, Improved Vampiric Blood it is. If it's pretty manageable, I think Improved Heartstrike is the best default choice. A lot of the talents over here on this left side, like Rune Tap, Reinforced Bones, Blood Feast. A lot of these are kind of underwhelming, especially in Mythic Plus. Like the 10% more armor from Bone Shield really doesn't add up to a ton. It's about 300 more armor. You can see Bone Shield gives you 3,700 more armor. It's only a couple percentage points of damage reduction. When you compare that to some of the other talents that are right beside it, you know, Hemostasis, when you're death striking, when you're blood boiling in a stack of like 5 enemies, you're basically getting 40% more death strike on every death strike that you've blood boiled for. You're blood boiling most of your death strike, so on average, like 40% more death strike healing. I'm gonna definitely take that over like 2.5% damage reduction. I should also point out Purgatory, which I think is fine. I do generally think that is more of a raid pseudo defensive cooldown, but it has a pretty high cost to get to it. You have to spec into, just to take out those points in Shattering Bone, just to kind of show how to get down there. You have to spec into Tightening Grasp, which is a Gorfine's Grasp cooldown reduction and very tiny damage increase, like small enough that it basically doesn't do anything. Or you have to take Heartrend, which is one of the worst talents in any tank tree. The proc rate on this is really low. It's like a couple of times a minute you get 20% more damage on a death strike. You compare this, which is all the way down here at the bottom 3 rows of the tree, very low proc chance on a death strike, damage only increase. 20% more damage, that's it. You compare that to this, you know, regularly getting 40% more damage and healing on your death strike, and it's very high up in the tree. This is just horrendously disappointing as a talent. So, in general, I think that Purgatory is just kind of blocked off. It's not inaccessible, but you do have to give up some value talents to get there. You basically have to give up either like Voracious or some of these points elsewhere in the tree that are pretty valuable. Hemostasis and then take Heartrend. You know, lose a point out of Shattering Bone or lose a point out of Bloodshot. More realistically, keep those Shattering Bone points in, they're great. But yeah, you know, it's just not that great. I mean, you could go this way, not take Gorfine's Grasp, just go through Heartrend. That is certainly an option. But the better option is to not take Purgatory at all. Umbilicus Eternus is conceptually fine. You know, if you're in large scale AoE and you have Blood Plague rolling on a bunch of enemies all at once, you Vampiric Blood, and then it's, you know, ticking for a fair amount, you get a nice little shield at the end of it. It's not humongous. You know, you're gonna get basically like a decent sized shield every 45 seconds or so. I tend to think that this is a little bit of bait. It's much easier to take damage options elsewhere and just make up for that little bit of shielding with more death strikes, more skillful application of death strikes that you're buffing with talents like Hemostasis, because that is ultimately what you would have to give up to get Umbilicus Eternus. You'd have to give up either like a major damage increase in Bloodshot or Shattering Bone, or Voracious giving you more healing, or Hemostasis giving you more damage and healing. All of these talents are really great. You just don't want to sacrifice them. Now let's take a look at the raid build, which is a little bit different in both trees. You'll notice first thing over here in the left tree, I'm opting out of all of these sort of CC utility talents. Not taking Blinding Sleet, not taking Asphyxiate. Presumably, I wouldn't need to stun anything in raid. If you did, then you would probably want to drop March of Darkness or Anti-Magic Barrier if it's not useful for the specific fight to get those CC talents, but I think generally that's not the case. There is one alternate build I've played around with a little bit, just like looked at and thought, oh, that's interesting, in the left-hand tree, and that is for pure single target or 2-target fights. You don't need Cleaving Strikes. This literally is a worthless point in pure single target. So in that case, you would probably want to drop that, or potentially want to drop that, because it does link into Enfeeble, which turns your ghoul into a pretty nice little defensive cooldown, and it leads you down into Brittle, which is an okay, just sort of rolling damage increase for yourself, and then all of these wonderful talents down here. And you would come down through Suppression, into Might of Thessarian, basic strength increase, Unholy Endurance, excellent increase to the value of Lichborn, turns it into a minor defensive cooldown, Unholy Ground. And then you sort of have yourself a free point because you've given up Cleaving Strikes, which isn't doing anything for you. I really only see 3 places that you can put this point for a raid build, and those would be Acclamation, just for a little bit more defensive cooldown availability, Assimilation for a little bit more raid utility, or Death Pact, which I think, because of this 30% absorb shield that it puts on you, is kind of bait, but it is an option. Then you gain access to Wraithwalk, and this is sort of what I consider like the meme speed DK build here. So you're still getting all the way down to Empower Rune Weapon and Abomination Limb. You're still getting Death's Echo, which is incredibly important for maintaining Death and Decay uptime, and really just good quality of life for having those extra Death's advances. You know, having 2 Death's advances, especially with March of Darkness, actually makes DK relatively mobile. Having 2 Death Grips can be very valuable. Having the ability to grip 2 mobs in right in a short span of each other, and then sure, there's a longer recharge time, but that's a pretty common situation when tanking on a DK. You might have 2 range mobs out at range, gotta pull them in, and then it's 45 seconds to the next pull, or 50 seconds till the next ad spawn. This is great. And Insidious Chill, just very basic. Attack speed slow on your enemy, great to have in every situation. It makes you take basically 20% less auto attack damage from your enemy, and a lot of the time in raid, auto attack damage is going to be kind of the most consistent, steady source of damage intake. Now in the right tree over here, I was playing around, obviously, as you could see, just trying to get down here to get to Purgatory. There we go, that's better. Taking 1 point out of Red Thirst. Definitely do want to keep that point in Shattering Bone. It's free damage, it's free real estate, you don't want to give that up. But this is sort of the, like, goofy build over here on the left. I don't think I would normally run this. I would rather have Cleaving Strikes, Enfeeble, Brittle, Clinching Grasp. But if you really needed mobility and all the different keybinds you possibly could get for defensive cooldowns, this is an option. Pretty fast version of a DK, actually. You'll notice over here on the left tree, I'm not going through Heartbreaker, not going through Leeching Strike, and not going through Blood Tap. You are leaving some resource generation on the table by going this route, but you're getting a bit more passive damage reduction. You're getting Foul Bulwark, which gives you, on average, 5 to 10% more life. Pretty nice. Still getting improved Bone Shield, 10% more haste, that's vital, and you're getting that, you want to go out of your way to get this talent. It's quite a lot of value. Reinforced Bones, not so great. It's unfortunate that it's here in place of Blood Tap. It really would be nice to not have to spend these 3 points to get down here to get this. But in single target, getting 2 extra runic power per Heart Strike and 0.5% of your health back every Heart Strike is really low value for 3 points. And Rune Tap usually, as it has been through most of Shadowlands, usually is a misplay. Usually using Rune Tap is the wrong play. You will get more defensive value out of hitting Heart Strike and getting the extra 5 runic power, and then being able to Death Strike more than you would out of Rune Tap. So like I said, this is the Purgatory setup, but this is optional. If you wanted to go for something more damage oriented, if you need Gorfine's Grasp, but you only need it on 2-minute cooldown, you could go with something like this, take Hemostasis, and come down here and take Blood Drinker. Blood Drinker does, with this level of gear that I'm at on this character, 23,000 damage, 30-second cooldown. When you compare that to Heart Strike, 4,600 damage, that's pretty good. That is an option for a little bit more of a balance of damage output and damage reduction. Bloodworms are another nice defensive self-healing trickle. Very small amount of damage trickle, but technically not 0, technically a damage add, but relatively minor. There are a lot of talents over here on this right side that, unlike Blood Drinker, and consumption is pretty bad, but unlike Blood Drinker, are non-negotiable. Relish in Blood you want to take just for navigating down the tree cheaper. Perseverance of the Ebon Blade, versatility proc's nice, but the amount is too small for the cost. But Voracious, 20% more Death Strike healing, that's basically just 20% more healing. Imagine any other tank being able to just randomly in the middle of the tree get like 20% stronger. It's crazy how good this talent is. And Coagulopathy, 5% more damage all the time. And this buff, if you actually are sitting there and maintaining this buff, which, you know, if you're maintaining if you're maintaining Icy Talons on a single target, Death Striking every 5 to 6 seconds, you will easily stack this up to 8 times. Your Blood Plague hits for triple damage. I think my Blood Plague on some training dummies was hitting for over 3k damage a tick, which isn't too bad considering it's a kind of passive throwaway damage that everybody's always just kind of ignored. Hard to say no to free damage, and then again, more free damage. 5% more damage, 5% more healing while standing in Death and Decay. You get 5% haste here, 5% damage and healing here. You get triple damage on all of your Shattering Bones over here. You have Tombstone that eats 5 Bone Shield charges and does damage for every single one of them here. So you set down a Death and Decay, you have a bunch of Bone Shield charges, you hit Tombstone. It's sort of like a defense or offensive cooldown, but also a defensive cooldown because it's giving you a 30% of health shield. It's giving you a bunch of runic power, giving you a bunch of cooldown reduction on Dancing Rune Weapon, thanks to Insatiable Blade. It's all pretty nice. And all you have to do is be maintaining that Death and Decay, consistently using your runes to maintain your Bone Shield through Death's Caress and Marrow Rend. Less Marrow Rend now than in the past, thankfully. And then just hitting Death Strike, you know, pretty consistently every 5 or 6 seconds or so. So if I didn't want to take Purgatory, and I think I usually don't, I probably would go with a talent tree that looks something like this. If I was more concerned about my ability to survive, especially in more single target situations, but, you know, a situation where I needed Gorfine's Grasp, let's say I would come down this way. If I didn't need Gorfine's Grasp, I guess I would go through Heartrend. And then there you go. You have that second point in Red Thirst available to you, just for more defensive cooldown availability, the extra layer of Purgatory. I think that works pretty well. In terms of the playstyle, Blood DK is pretty different. It now has a fairly complicated and demanding core rotation, which is quite a shift from how it functioned for a lot of years now. It's a bit like the jump up in complexity that Monk has experienced with Dragonflight. The big difference here is that Monk's increase in complexity is mostly about managing like literally a dozen different offensive and defensive cooldowns, whereas the difference with DK is about managing several extremely powerful personal buffs that you need to keep active through your base rotation. You don't actually have that many offensive skills you need to use, not that many keybinds you need to manage. Death's Caress is now a very efficient Bone Shield generator that you can often use instead of Marrow Rend, but that's basically all that you have to add to the collection of base skills you used in Shadowlands. Instead, the difference between Dragonflight and Shadowlands is more about how you use the skills that were already in your base toolkit. You want to be Death Striking at least once every 6 seconds, more like every 5 just to be safe, in order to maintain Icy Talons. You want to be maintaining Death and Decay at all times for the amazing buff to your haste, damage, and healing, as well as the damage increase for Shattering Bone. You want to try and maximize the value of Bloodshot as best as possible as well by timing your Heart Strikes immediately after a Death Strike. All of these little things add up to a big increase in your damage and your self-healing. If you can master the rotation and manage your cooldowns effectively, you can almost become unkillable. And despite me saying it's one of the more complex tanks, which is true, I don't really think it's that bad once you get over the initial learning curve. A bit of the difficulty of getting comfortable with Monk, for example, is that the new keybinds you have to add are all mostly major cooldowns, so they're important skills, but they're not actually skills you hit that often to get that much practice, you know, tapping your keys differently. In DK's case, it's basically the opposite. You have pretty much all the same skills you always had, you just have to hit them in a different order now. You don't have an overwhelming number of keybinds, you don't have to add a ton of new things in for your fingers to manage pressing. I mean, DK has a lot of cooldowns just like it did in Shadowlands, but your keybinds haven't ballooned in transitioning into Dragonflight. You have the same 5 basic rotational skills as before. Now you use Death's Caress 2, that's 6. You can add a couple of other situational like crowd control abilities or defensive cooldowns or group utility cooldowns here or there, but those are all mostly optional. In terms of resources, you have so much more available to you than you have ever had before. Deathstrike's runic power cost has gone all the way down to 35 RP under normal circumstances. You generate about 2 Deathstrikes worth of runic power just from auto attacks each minute. You have a very powerful resource generation cooldown in the class tree in the form of Empower Rune Weapon, and you have the option of taking Blood Tap and Heartbreaker in the spec tree for even more resource generation. You just have more resources just about than you're able to consume, and they are worth more healing than ever. You get tons of passive trickles of self-healing as well. Even just being able to pick up talents like Bloodworms, Relish in Blood, Foul Bulwark, and Voracious all at the same time adds so much passive defensive value that you weren't able to get all at the same time in previous expansions. And just to add on top of that, your Death Strikes heal for a larger amount of damage taken now, and your Blood Shields shield for 20% more than before thanks to Iron Heart. So is Blood DK good? Yeah, it's really good. It's super, super tanky. It's still the same giant health bar, self-healing machine that it's always been. It just has way more runes and runic power to work with now than it did before, and so it heals for more. The biggest downside of the current redesign of DK is the way they deal damage. There's a conception that DK damage is just bad, and I wouldn't quite agree with that. In some cases, it's just user error, but that's not all bad play either. The base rotation is a lot more complex now. You've gone from just maintaining Bone Shield and, I guess, Blood Plague, to maintaining Bone Shield and Blood Plague, Death and Decay, Icy Talons, and trying to squeak out extra physical damage during Blood Shield windows. You can deal pretty respectable damage on a Blood DK once you have the hang of managing everything, but you will still need several seconds to get your buffs up and your debuffs set up and rolling at the start of a pull. You can't just roll in and hit Exploding Keg, or leap in and cast Elysian Decree and be doing 80 or 100,000 DPS to start off a pull. Abomination Limb is a really good utility and AoE damage cooldown, but Blood is nowhere close to Monk and Demon Hunter when it comes to being able to put out huge burst damage in a short window, especially in AoE. DK damage is extremely consistent, which is good and bad. It means you should never have pulls where you can't hold threat because your cooldowns aren't available. That's good. The lack of burst damage also means that you're probably never going to have pulls where you run in and absolutely carry the group's damage, blow all your cooldowns, and obliterate a pack of ads on your own. Slow and steady, but nothing flashy. That's not really the most irritating downside to me. I've found that the biggest downside in my experience of playing Blood DK is just simply having to fight in the Death and Decay circles all the time. This makes dealing with mobs that jump around kind of frustrating. The cooldown of Death and Decay is short enough, especially with Crimson Scourge resets, that this isn't a horrible issue, but it is something you have to keep in mind pretty much all the time that you're tanking mobs. And that can be annoying. The upside here is that DK has extremely strong cooldowns, world-class self-healing, respectable sustained damage output, and a fun, engaging rotation. But there are some maintenance buffs, and you do have to be conscious of your positioning pretty much all the time. I'm very happy with the state of Blood Death Knights going into Dragonflight. The rotation in Shadowlands was getting very stale, and the new talents are a fresh coat of paint on a class that already had a very solid foundation. It did not need to be rebuilt from the ground up. It just needed some tweaks to the tools it already had, and that's precisely what DK has received. The defensive cooldowns are still very strong, and the passive defenses are even stronger than before. Blood DKs are more fun, more engaging, and a lot more consistent from moment to moment, and the class has even more of the amazing self-healing power that it has always prided itself on. It no longer has to deal with the stress of trying to maintain Dancing Rune Weapon all the time so that enemies don't instantly turn you into red mist. DK is the tank that has the highest degree of control over its survival. That's very appealing, and it's what sets it apart from basically every other tank in the game right now. Blood DKs, they're still really good. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.